There is a document sitting inside a museum in Turin, Italy, that scholars have quietly studied for over 2 centuries and never fully agreed on how to explain. It is not a myth. It is not a religious text passed down by storytellers. It is an official administrative record written by Egyptian scribes listing the names and reign lengths of every ruler who ever governed the land of Egypt. And buried inside that list before the names of any human pharaoh are the names of gods, demigods, and beings who reportedly ruled for tens of thousands of years. The Egyptian priests who compiled it did not file these beings away as folklore. In the same administrative format used for every mortal king, they called them kings too. So here is the question worth sitting with for a moment. What if the story of human civilization you were taught in school, the one that begins neatly with Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt around 5,000 years ago, was not the beginning at all? What if it was simply the most recent chapter in a story that stretches back further than most textbooks are willing to entertain? Not necessarily because the evidence is being hidden, more likely because the evidence is fragmentary, genuinely difficult to interpret, and deeply uncomfortable for a field that has spent generations building a clean, linear timeline of human progress. This is not settled science. Much of what follows sits at the edge of, and in some cases well outside, mainstream archaeological consensus. Some of it is backed by peer-reviewed geology. Some of it is a minority hypothesis that most specialists in the field actively dispute. I want to walk through all of it honestly. What is documented fact, what is a real but contested scientific hypothesis, and what is still, by any reasonable standard, speculation. Because the story is compelling enough without needing to pretend every piece of it is proven. Let's start with the document itself. The Turin King List, preserved today in the Museo Egizio in Turin, Italy, is a papyrus written during the reign of Pharaoh Ramesses II. Somewhere around 1279 BCE, it was not carved onto a temple wall to glorify a single dynasty. It was not designed for public display or political theater. By most scholarly reconstructions, it was a working administrative document, a king list compiled from older temple archives, tax records, and royal decrees. The Egyptians treated it the way a modern government might treat a census: functional, comprehensive, not built for spectacle. What makes it extraordinary is what appears before the names of any human ruler. The list does not open with Pharaoh Menes, traditionally regarded as the founder of the first dynasty. It opens with gods, then demigods, then a category of beings the original hieratic script describes roughly as spirits or shades, and the reign lengths assigned to them are staggering. The closing lines of that section, in the scribe's own summary, read approximately, "The venerable followers of Horus, 13,220 years. The reigns before the followers of Horus, 23,200 years. Total, 36,620 years." Sit with that number for a second. 36,620 years. Not a rounding error. Not obviously poetic exaggeration. A scribal total, written in the same bureaucratic style used to record the reign of every human pharaoh on the same papyrus. Whatever the Egyptian priests believed these entities were, they were not filing them under myth. They were filing them under history, as predecessors, not as metaphors. And the Turin Papyrus is not an isolated document. The Palermo Stone, a fragment of black basalt believed to date to Egypt's 5th dynasty, around 2500 BCE, records the names and reign lengths of predynastic rulers who governed before the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. These rulers sit outside the period modern archaeology treats as the start of Egyptian civilization. The stone does not flag them as legendary. It lists them with the same administrative confidence as fully historical figures, and moves on. Then there's Manetho, an Egyptian priest and historian writing during the reign of Ptolemy II, around 280 BCE. Manetho compiled a history of Egypt for its new Greek rulers, drawing on temple archives that no longer survive. Fragments of his work, preserved through later historians like Josephus and Africanus, describe a pre-human epoch of divine and semi-divine rule lasting thousands of years before the first mortal king. He names Menes as the first fully human king, placing him around 400 BCE. Before that, in Manetho's account, the land belonged to someone or something else. 3 separate Egyptian sources, compiled at different times from different archives by different people, independently describing the same basic shape, an immense pre-human epoch preceding the Egypt we recognize from the history books. The standard academic explanation for this has always been fairly simple, and it deserves to be stated fairly. These are mythological or theological traditions, most Egyptologists argue, not historical records in the modern sense. The reign of gods before Menes is understood by most scholars as a legitimizing narrative, a way of connecting a new dynasty to the divine, not a literal chronicle of who ruled the Nile Valley 40,000 years ago. That explanation is coherent, widely accepted, and it's worth saying clearly the position held by the overwhelming majority of professional Egyptologists today. Where things get more genuinely contested is not in Egypt at all. It's roughly 1,000 miles north on a ridge in southeastern Turkey. In the mountains above the modern city of Şanlıurfa sits a site called Göbekli Tepe Belly Hill in Turkish. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most important archaeological discoveries of the last century, and it remains strangely under-discussed outside specialist circles. It was first noted in a 1960s agricultural survey. Researchers at the time spotted large stones in the hillside and logged them as Byzantine-era grave markers. The site was filed and forgotten. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt visited and realized the classification was wrong. These weren't grave markers. They were the tops of massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with precision and covered in relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. Schmidt began excavating the following year, and what emerged over the next 2 decades genuinely reshaped how archaeologists think about the earliest chapters of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe is reliably dated to roughly 9,500 BCE, more than 11,000 years old. That predates the pyramids of Giza by over 6,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by roughly the same margin. It predates the invention of writing by around 5,000 years. According to the framework that dominated archaeology for most of the 20th century, the people building this were hunter-gatherers, mobile, non-agricultural, and by the old assumptions, not organizationally capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting multi-ton stone pillars arranged with apparent intentional design. And yet it exists. It is not a hypothesis. It is a real excavated site you can walk through. Since Schmidt's original work, later excavations have uncovered evidence of cisterns, permanent housing, and grain processing tools, suggesting this may not have been purely a seasonal ritual gathering site, but something closer to sustained settlement, a real community with the coordination to plan and complete monumental construction. This is the part where mainstream archaeology and speculative theory genuinely diverge, and it's worth being precise about where that line sits. Most archaeologists studying Göbekli Tepe do not conclude that this proves a prior lost advanced civilization seeded the knowledge. The mainstream position is that it demonstrates hunter-gatherer societies were capable of far more social complexity, coordination, and symbolic sophistication than earlier models assumed a genuinely important and well-supported revision. The idea that Göbekli Tepe's builders inherited engineering knowledge from an entirely separate, vanished prior civilization is a minority interpretation, championed most visibly by writers like Graham Hancock, and it is explicitly rejected by most professional archaeologists working on the site, including the excavation teams themselves. I want to be upfront about that distinction because The honest version of the story is more interesting than the simplified one. The real well-supported mystery is, how did societies without agriculture, writing, or metal tools organize themselves to build something like this? The more speculative extension hat they were taught by refugees of an earlier lost global civilization is possible to entertain as a thought experiment, but it is not where the evidence currently points according to the archaeologists who've spent their careers at the site. What is genuinely interesting and much better supported is what happened next in the geological record. Around 12,800 years ago, Earth was in the middle of warming up from the last ice age. Ice sheets were retreating, sea levels were climbing. Then, within what geological evidence suggests was a remarkably short window, global temperatures dropped sharply, plunging the planet back into near glacial conditions for roughly 1,200 years. This period is called the Younger Dryas, and its cause has been debated for decades. In 2007, a group of researchers proposed the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, that a fragmenting comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere above the North American ice sheet around 12,800 years ago, triggering widespread fires. A massive meltwater pulse into the North Atlantic disrupted ocean circulation, and an impact winter that pushed temperatures back down for over a millennium. It's important to say plainly, this is a real published, actively researched hypothesis, and it is also genuinely contested within the geoscience community. Proponents point to evidence including platinum group anomalies, nanodiamonds, melted glass materials called spherules, and a continental-scale biomass burning layer identified at multiple sites across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and South America, all clustering at the same geological boundary. Critics, and there are many serious ones in mainstream geology, argue these signatures can often be explained by other processes, that the dating isn't always as tightly clustered as proponents claim, and that a comet impact remains an unnecessary explanation for a climate shift that has other plausible causes, like ocean circulation changes from meltwater alone. This debate is ongoing in the literature, not settled in either direction. If the impact hypothesis is correct, though, the physical consequences are worth walking through, because they connect to something else entirely, the map of the ancient world. At the peak of the last ice age, roughly 20,000 years ago, global sea levels sat about 400 feet lower than they do today. That is not speculative. It's a well-established finding from ice core and marine sediment records. Enormous areas of continental shelf that are underwater today were, at that time, dry land, often temperate, often habitable. Here's the implication that doesn't get discussed enough. Virtually every archaeological survey of early human habitation has been conducted on land that is currently above water. We've excavated hillsides, river valleys, deserts, and built our historical maps almost entirely from what happened to survive on dry ground. If human communities existed on those now submerged coastal plains before sea levels rose, we have, by definition, never properly surveyed the area where they would have lived. That's not a conspiracy. It's a genuine, acknowledged gap in the archaeological record. Underwater archaeology is expensive, difficult, and comparatively young as a field. Submerged structures have in fact been documented in several places. Off the coast of India in the Gulf of Khambat, in the North Sea region, researchers call Doggerland a once inhabited plain that stayed above water until roughly 8,000 BCE, and in scattered surveys near Cuba, the Aegean, and the Persian Gulf. Some of these findings are well supported by mainstream marine archaeology. Others, particularly some of the more dramatic underwater city claims, remain disputed or unverified pending further study. The honest state of the field is, there is clearly more to find underwater than we've found so far, and clearly less certainty about what exactly is down there than some popular claims suggest. This is where the speculative thread of the story gets built, and I want to flag clearly that this next part is an interpretive leap, not an established finding. If you count backward roughly 3,620 years from the start of the First Dynasty around 3100 BCE, you land somewhere around 39,000 BCE deep in the Paleolithic, a period when modern humans were unquestionably present, living in small mobile groups, with none of the material evidence for organized civilization that we associate with later periods. Some researchers and independent writers have proposed connecting this number to the idea of a pre-catastrophe global civilization, destroyed or scattered by the Younger Dryas event, with the reign of the gods in Egyptian records representing folk memory of that lost world passed down and eventually formalized into royal genealogy. It's a genuinely evocative idea. It is also not a position held by mainstream Egyptology or archaeology, which continues to interpret the predynastic reigns of the gods as a legitimizing religious tradition, rather than a literal historical record of a specific vanished civilization. One more piece often cited in this argument is Göbekli Tepe's Pillar 43, sometimes called the Vulture Stone. In 2013, researcher Martin Sweatman proposed that its carved animal symbols encode a specific date, potentially referencing a comet event, and dated the possible configuration to somewhere close to the Younger Dryas boundary. This interpretation has drawn real academic pushback. Critics argue the symbolic reading is speculative, that the date derived depends heavily on chosen astronomical software and assumptions, and that ascribing precise astronomical intent to carvings from a non-literate society thousands of years before writing is difficult to verify one way or the other. It remains an intriguing but unresolved argument, not an accepted finding. What is documented, and much less disputed, is that roughly 1,000 years after its construction phases, the people of Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried the site, filling the enclosures with rubble rather than letting them fall into ruin naturally. Archaeologists broadly agree this was intentional, though the reason remains genuinely unknown. Whether it was ritual closure, a change in belief systems, or something else entirely, is an open question in the field. Not evidence of foreknowledge of catastrophe, but it is undeniably one of archaeology's better unsolved mysteries. It's worth addressing directly why more speculative interpretations of this evidence haven't taken over mainstream archaeology, because there's a version of this story that frames that resistance as suppression. The more accurate framing is that archaeology, like most sciences, moves conservatively by design. Extraordinary claims are expected to clear a high evidentiary bar before displacing an existing, well-supported framework, and the lost advanced global civilization version of this story has, so far, not cleared that bar for most specialists, not because the idea is unwelcome, but because the physical evidence for it specifically, as opposed to evidence for a genuinely fascinating and revised picture of hunter-gatherer capability, remains thin. That doesn't mean the underlying mysteries aren't real. Göbekli Tepe's existence alone forced a real, significant peer-reviewed revision of when organized human construction projects began. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis is a legitimate ongoing scientific debate, not settled science in either direction. The submerged continental shelves genuinely represent an underexplored piece of the archaeological record. All of that is true without needing to accept the more speculative overlay of a fully formed lost global civilization whose refugees taught the builders of Göbekli Tepe. There's one more layer to the Turin King List worth knowing, because it shapes how much weight the document can really bear. It was found in Egypt in 1822 by Italian diplomat Bernardino Drivetti, transported to Turin, and damaged, crumbling into fragments during the journey. Scholars have spent the 2 centuries painstakingly piecing it back together. The reconstruction remains incomplete. Sections are illegible. Some portions, plausibly including some of the most detailed early material, are simply lost. That incompleteness cuts both ways. It means we can't fully verify the most extraordinary claims embedded in the document because the fullest version of it no longer exists. It also means we shouldn't treat what survives as either definitively proven or definitively dismissed. It's a genuinely damaged, partial historical source, and honest scholarship has to sit with that ambiguity rather than resolve it in whichever direction makes the better story. Here's a version of the picture that tries to hold the documented and the speculative in their proper places. We know with real confidence that organized, symbolically sophisticated human construction goes back further than the field assumed even 30 years ago. Göbekli Tepe alone proved that. We know the younger Dryas was a real dramatic climate reversal, and that a comet impact is one seriously proposed, seriously contested explanation among several. We know sea levels were dramatically lower during the Ice Age, and that underwater archaeology remains a genuinely underdeveloped frontier. We know ancient Egyptian priests kept detailed administrative records that placed divine and semi-divine rulers before the first human pharaoh, for reasons that mainstream scholarship generally attributes to religious legitimization rather than literal history. What we don't know, and what remains genuinely speculative rather than established, is whether all of these threads describe one single lost global civilization, wiped out in a specific comet catastrophe roughly 12,800 years ago, whose survivors seeded the knowledge behind Göbekli Tepe and whose folk memory became the reign of the gods in Egyptian records. That version of the story is compelling. It is also, by the standards of the archaeologists and geologists actually working on this material, unproven, an interpretation layered on top of several individually real, individually contested pieces of evidence. Maybe that's the more honest place to end up. Not academia is hiding the truth from you, but something closer to the deep past is genuinely stranger, older, and less finished than the tidy version most of us learned in school. And the honest scientific frontier here is still being actively argued over in real journals by real researchers who disagree with each other in good faith. The Turin King List is still sitting in that museum in Turin. Göbekli Tepe is still standing open to the sky above Şanlıurfa. The nanodiamonds and impact spherules are still in the geological record, still being debated paper by paper. None of it is hidden. Most of it is simply unresolved, which, if you think about it, might be the more interesting place for the story to actually sit. We are, in some very real sense, still early chapters into figuring out how old our own story actually is. Whether we are the first chapter that finally gets it right, or just the latest attempt in a longer pattern we haven't fully mapped yet, isn't something the evidence has answered. It's something we're still in the process of finding out.